Have you ever wondered what it feels like to finally be seen, not as a burden, not as a mistake, but as someone worth loving on one frozen night in the rugged frontier? A little boy knocked on the wrong cabin door. He had no last name, no family, and no hope left in his eyes. And yet, when Clara Callahan opened that door, her empty arms, after years of heartbreak, suddenly found what her heart had always prayed for. But here lies the question when a child arrives by mistake. Does love have the power to make it right when the law demands obedience? But your soul whispers, "This is my son." What would you choose? Imagine holding a child who has already been passed from place to place, told again and again that he doesn't belong. Would you risk everything, your reputation, your home, even your freedom to keep him safe tonight? We step into a story where faith, love, and courage collide on the harsh frontier. Stay with us and let your heart decide what home truly means. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you won't miss stories like this one. Now, let's begin. He was never meant to come to this place. The letter bore the wrong name, the wrong cabin, the wrong destination. Yet, when Clara opened the door and saw the orphan boy standing in the snow, her heart cracked wide open and then, somehow, began to mend. The child hadn't even knocked. He stood silently, boots soaked through, one mitten missing, hair clumped with ice against his forehead. Snow gathered around his legs as if it meant to bury him where he stood. The wind howled down the ridge, carrying icy flakes like shards of glass, but he made no move to shield himself. His eyes fixed on the doorway with a hollow look that seemed to have given up on hope altogether. Clara had been slicing carrots near the hearth when she heard it a whimper. Not quite a voice, more like the sound of something breaking inside a chest too small to hold much pain. She dropped the knife. By the time she reached the door, her pulse was already hammering the way it always did when sorrow brushed too close to memory. She pulled it wide. The boy flinched as though she had struck him, squinting up through the storm. He could not have been more than 7, maybe younger, the way he hunched his shoulders and pressed his lips tight as if crying were forbidden. In his good hand he clutched a scrap of paper, soaked through and trembling in the wind. Behind her, the fire snapped loudly. She did not ask who he was. She did not need to. She stepped aside. "Come in," she said. The boy hesitated not out of fear, but disbelief, like he had learned that doors were not meant to open for him. At last, he obeyed. The cold drifted in after him like a spirit before Clara shut it out. He stood, dripping, silent. She knelt slowly, reaching for the crumpled paper. His lips barely moved. "They told me this was the place. They said somebody here wanted a child." Her breath caught. Heavy footsteps sounded. Thomas entered from the back room, brushing sawdust from his palms. He froze at the sight of the boy. His eyes narrowed, not in cruelty, but in the sharp way a man studies something he cannot yet name. Clara rose and handed him the paper. Thomas scanned it, his jaw tightening. Then he looked at the boy. "What's your name?" The child straightened his back. "Eli." Clara's knees weakened. She looked at him again and saw not only the frostbite and bruises, but the way he carried himself, as if even the air he breathed had to be earned. "How old are you?" "Eli," she asked. 7, I think," he whispered. Thomas glanced at Clara. Silence fell between them, but not the empty kind. It was the silence filled with words unsaid, names never spoken, rooms that had stayed barren. Clara crouched again, laying her hands gently on Eli's narrow shoulders. "You're safe now. We'll warm you, feed you, and then we'll sort out where you were meant to go." Eli did not nod. He simply collapsed. Clara caught him before he hit the floor. His body was feather light, all bone and rags, his skin pale beneath soot and snow. Thomas was already pulling down a blanket from the peg near the fire, kneeling beside them as Clara pressed her hand to the boy's back. "He's burning," she whispered. Fever like his body finally stopped fighting. They carried him to the couch, stripped away his soaked coat, wrapped him in wool, and laid him close to the fire's warmth. Clara fed the flames higher. Thomas brought water. For a long while, there was nothing but the sound of breath and the wind battering the shutters. The cabin, once hollow with silence, now felt full, alive. Hours passed. Eli did not wake. His fists clutched the edge of the blanket, as though letting go might send him back into the storm. Clara stayed beside him, brushing damp strands from his forehead. Her voice came soft, almost a prayer. "We need to know who sent him." Thomas nodded, but kept his gaze on the boy. Clara spoke again. "I know that look." What look, he asked. "The same one you had the first time we talked about adoption, the look of a man who wanted a child more than breath." Thomas did not answer at once. When he did, his voice was quiet. "Clara, maybe God sent him to us." Years ago, she might have scoffed, back when miscarriages had drained every drop of hope from her heart. But now she only looked at Eli again and let the thought stay in the warmth between them. Before dawn, Eli stirred awake, not with a jolt, but slowly, like someone unaccustomed to peace. When he saw Clara sitting near, he flinched. "Easy," she soothed. "You're safe. No one will send you back into that storm." He blinked, then his shoulders loosened. "Hungry?" she asked. He gave a single nod. She fed him porridge with a touch of honey. He devoured it in silence, as though words might cost him another bite. When Thomas entered and saw him awake, he only smiled faintly and poured tea. Later, Clara went out to tend the coop, snow glittering in the sunlight like a field of diamonds. Inside, Thomas sat by the fire with Eli wrapped in their thickest quilt. "Do you remember who gave you the letter?" he asked. Eli nodded. "The preacher in Ironwood. Did he say who it was for?" The boy hesitated. "A family named Whitmore." Thomas's stomach sank. "We're the Callahans," he said carefully. Eli froze. His eyes darted to the door. "I'm not sending you away," Thomas said quickly, "but it looks like there was a mistake." Eli's voice came hoarse. "They always make mistakes." Silence pressed against the walls again, the kind that seeps deep into the ribs. Thomas cleared his throat. "How long were you with the preacher?" "A while." "Before that?" "I stayed with Miss Alma." "Before that, I don't remember." "And your folks gone?" How Eli shrugged. One day they were there, then they weren't. Thomas nodded slowly, his chest aching in ways words could not touch. When Clara returned and heard, she sat heavily by the hearth. "What do we do?" she whispered. Thomas did not answer right away. His eyes lingered on Eli, who was tracing invisible shapes into the wood grain of the table. Finally he said, "We ask him what he wants." Clara turned to Eli. "Do you want us to send a letter to the preacher, to this Whitmore family?" Eli did not look up. "No." Why not? His eyes lifted, wet now for the first time, "Because I don't want to go." The air stilled. Even the fire hushed. "Why not?" Thomas asked softly. because you're the first people who didn't look at me like I was trouble. You gave me soup and a blanket, and you didn't make me earn it." Clara blinked against the sting in her eyes. The boy had spoken with such urgency, as though he needed to convince them that he was worth the space he took up. "I can chop wood," Eli blurted, his voice shaking but determined. "I'm quick. I can fetch water, help with the animals. I don't eat much." Before he could say more, Clara interrupted, her voice breaking. "Eli, you don't have to earn a place here." Thomas rose from his chair and walked over, his boots heavy against the floorboards. He knelt so his eyes were level with the boy's. One hand rested firmly on Eli's small shoulder. "You're not a burden, son," he said softly. "You're a blessing." Eli's lips trembled. "You want me to stay." Clara's throat caught, and the words left her in a rush, as though they'd been waiting all her life. "Please, be our child." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It filled the cabin with something sacred, too tender to name aloud. Eli sat between them, still small enough to vanish if someone looked away too long, but the slow, steady rise of his chest felt like a miracle. Clara had never said those words before, not even when the last crib was taken down, not when the midwife whispered, not this time. Not even on the nights she buried her face in Thomas's chest and wept for children who had never come. Yet here the words were, uninvited but truer than anything she had spoken. That evening the storm had passed, leaving behind a strange stillness. Every sound was sharper now, the scrape of spoons against bowls, the groan of the wood settling. The quiet sniffles Eli tried to hide while taking second helpings of stew. Thomas had carried in more wood than was necessary, feeding the fire until the room glowed almost too warm. But no one complained. The heat was more than fire, it was belonging. By the time Clara tucked Eli into the cot she'd pulled down from the loft, the boy no longer watched the shadows with one eye open. He allowed his head to sink into the pillow, shoulders softening, breathing steady. He trusted the walls to keep him safe. Clara lingered longer than she meant to, watching the gentle rise and fall of his chest, until Thomas's quiet voice came from the hall. Let the boy rest. Later, when they sat beside the fire, Clara whispered the fear that gnawed at her. What if they come for him? Thomas's face was etched with firelight and years of waiting. Then we tell them the truth. The boy came to the wrong house, but God doesn't make mistakes. You really believe that he looked at her, and in his gaze she saw all the sorrow of the past, but something else too, a spark that had nearly gone out years ago but flickered now, stubborn as ever. I believe we've waited long enough to know when something is right. Clara reached for his hand. He took it, and they needed no more words. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Eli spoke little, but when he did, his words carried weight, as if even simple questions were secrets he entrusted only to them. Clara tried not to hover, but she couldn't help watching him the way he studied how she chopped vegetables, how Thomas latched the chicken coop, how the kettle whistled just before it boiled. He absorbed every detail with the urgency of a child who had learned too soon that knowledge might be the only safety he could keep. He was small, but not fragile, thin, but not weak. He offered help before being asked, folded his blanket neatly, and thanked Clara for every meal. She reminded him he didn't need to earn his place, but he always nodded and kept trying anyway. On the third day, Thomas handed him an axe. Let's see how you handle kindling. It wasn't that Thomas needed help, but he wanted Eli to feel trusted. The first swing nearly clipped his boot. Thomas crouched beside him, steadying his grip and murmuring quiet instruction. The next strike landed clean. That night, Clara noticed 2 perfect bundles of firewood stacked neatly by the porch, the axe resting in the snow. She said nothing, only brushed her hand over Eli's head as she passed with supper. On the 5th day, a rider arrived from Ironwood, cheeks raw from wind. He carried a letter. Thomas opened it inside, and Clara saw the way his shoulders stiffened, his eyes reading it twice before speaking. They realized the mistake, he said at last, his voice heavy. They're sending someone to collect him. Clara's stomach dropped. On the floor, Eli sat playing with the buttons she'd let him take from her sewing tin. He didn't look up, but Clara knew he had heard. They said they're sorry. Thomas added, the Whitmore family. They've been waiting months. The papers were misfiled. Clara moved to Eli's side, sitting on the floor with him. She picked up a button, turning it between her fingers. The boy's hand stilled. Then, with quiet resignation, he stood. He didn't argue, didn't cry. He simply began folding his blanket as though he had always known this was how it would end. Clara's voice broke. You don't have to, sweetheart. I do? He didn't turn. They always come. Eli, Thomas said, stepping forward. The boy turned, his lip trembling, though his voice stayed steady. Thank you for letting me stay. For pretending. Clara dropped to her knees. It wasn't pretend, but Eli was already climbing into his worn boots. That night, the cabin felt hollow again. Thomas sat by the fire, staring into the flames as if willing them to consume the letter. Clara lay awake, watching Eli curled tightly in the cot with the blanket pulled high over his face. She did not cry until the wind rose again outside, reminding her of how he had looked the night he first appeared small, frozen, unwanted. Thomas's voice broke the silence. Maybe we could talk to the Whitmores. Maybe they'd understand. Clara turned to him sharply. Would you give him up if they asked no? Then why should they? The question settled like a weight in the room. Clara rose just before dawn, restless. When she came to the front room, Eli was already awake, dressed, standing by the door with the letter clenched in his small hand like a ticket back into the storm. He didn't touch the breakfast she set down, nor the plate she slid gently in front of him. When hoofbeats sounded on the ridge, Eli didn't move. Clara went to the door. 2 men waited outside. One was older, his face lined and solemn. The other wore a coat too new for trail riding, polished boots gleaming. They dismounted, offering polite smiles that carried no warmth. The younger man stepped forward and extended his hand politely. Ma'am, we're from the Ironwood Placement Board. We're here to collect young Eli. Clara did not take his hand. She turned slightly, her eyes moving to where the boy stood in the corner, clutching his worn satchel like it was all that kept him tethered. Then Thomas moved, not quickly, but with a steadiness that left no room for doubt. Before you take him, Thomas said evenly, I need to ask something. The 2 men exchanged a glance. Of course. The older one answered. Thomas turned toward Eli. Do you want to go? Eli's mouth opened, then closed. His voice came out as little more than a whisper. No. The man in the fine coat stiffened. Sir, with respect, this isn't how the process works. The Whitmore family has been approved. The boy was meant for them, but he wasn't sent to them, Clara said sharply, stepping up beside Thomas. He was sent here to us." The men looked at each other uneasily. "I'm sorry," the younger one said, "but we have orders." And that was when Eli broke. He didn't bolt for the door. He didn't flee. He ran straight into Clara's arms. He buried his face in her apron and clung to her waist with such desperation that her knees nearly buckled beneath the weight of it. "I want to stay," he sobbed. "I know, baby," Clara whispered, holding him tighter. "I know." Thomas faced the men, his voice low and firm. "You go back and tell them the truth. Tell them the boy chose us." The older man frowned. "That's not how this works. Do you really want to drag him out of here? Do you want to rip him from the arms of the only woman he's called mother since he lost his real one?" He spread his hands. "Be my guest." Neither man moved. Eli clung tighter, and for the first time in a long while. Clara did not let go either. They stood like that as time seemed to stretch, the fire popping behind them, the winter sun hardly shifting. Clara held the boy as if the wind itself might tear him away, while Thomas stood unyielding at the door, shoulders set like iron. The men from Ironwood weren't soldiers, but paper carried its own kind of power. Clara could feel it in their hesitation, in the way their boots stayed planted, though their presence pressed into the cabin like smoke seeping under the door. At last, the older man, hair gray at the temples and eyes weary from reading too many documents, cleared his throat. "You must understand, ma'am," he said gently. "We aren't here to cause pain. The boy was promised. There's another family good, decent, God-fearing—" "Don't you dare talk to me about God," Clara snapped. "Not when he is the only reason I opened my door that night." The man blinked, taken aback. "You want to do this by the letter," Thomas said firmly. "Then write a new letter. We'll sign whatever forms you need. We'll talk to the Whitmores ourselves. But you're not taking him from this house just to make your paperwork neat." The younger man fumbled inside his coat, pulling out a packet of forms, but his hand shook enough that the papers slipped. The top sheet blew into the brush outside. Neither Thomas nor Clara moved. Eli didn't even turn his head. He stayed pressed against Clara as if he were made of her. The older man sighed heavily. "We don't have the authority to overrule placement decisions." "Then go find someone who does," Thomas answered. The silence dragged long enough for the wind to whistle through the eaves. At last the younger man bent, gathered the dropped paper, folded it without looking up, and gave a curt nod to his partner. "We'll report this. You do that," Thomas said, "and the boy stays here until a decision is made." Clara added quickly, her voice like steel. "He's not a loaf of bread to be passed between tables. He's not a burden to be shuffled around until someone tires of him. He stays." The men didn't argue, not aloud anyway. They only nodded stiffly, mounted their horses, and rode back over the ridge. The clop of hooves faded into the wind, but the tension they left behind lingered, sharp as smoke after lightning. Clara didn't loosen her arms until the ridge was silent again. Only then did Eli's grip slacken. That night, Thomas built the fire higher than necessary, but neither he nor Clara commented. The boy sat between them on the floor, holding a mug of broth with both hands as if it were fragile enough to shatter. No one spoke of the visit. They didn't need to. When Clara rose to fetch a blanket and Thomas leaned to stoke the flames, Eli finally spoke, his voice small. "Will they come back?" Clara paused. "Maybe," she said carefully, "but if they do, we'll be ready." Eli nodded, though his eyes drifted far away. People like when you leave once they decide you don't belong? You belong here, Thomas said instantly, no hesitation in his voice. Eli didn't answer, but he pulled the quilt higher over his lap and sat a little straighter, as though testing the shape of those words in his chest. 4 days later, another letter came, this time not by writer, but through the post. Its seal was stamped official, heavy with authority. Inside was a second, smaller envelope, addressed not to Thomas or Clara, but to Eli himself. Clara read the main letter first, her lips pressed tight as she scanned it, then handed it to Thomas. He read quickly, but certain phrases struck like blows: temporary guardianship, pending review, procedural error acknowledged. The final sentence froze him completely. A decision will be rendered following communication with the intended adoptive family. Thomas looked up grimly. The Whitmores get the final say. Clara's face was unreadable. Eli stood near the corner, eyes fixed on the smaller envelope. Clara bent slightly. Do you want to open it? Eli nodded. His small hands tore the edge carefully. Inside was a single sheet, handwritten. He read it silently, blinking more than once, then handed it to Clara. Her hands shook as she unfolded it and read aloud. To the boy meant for us. We do not know your face, but we prayed for it. We do not know your voice, but we heard it in our dreams. We do not know your pain, but we long to help carry it. And yet you have ended up in the arms of another. That can only mean one thing. You were meant for them, not us. We will not contest the placement. Love is not possession. Love is release. Be happy. Be whole. Abigail and Martin Whitmore. Clara lowered the page slowly. Her hands trembled. Eli's lip quivered, but his shoulders sagged in relief, as though some heavy stone had slipped from his small frame. They sound like good people, he whispered. They do. Thomas agreed quietly. But you're not leaving, Clara said firmly. Not unless you choose to. Eli lifted his gaze, and for the first time since arriving, he smiled. Life changed after that, though not in the ways one might expect. There was no parade, no golden papers arriving in envelopes, only days, strung together one by one. Thomas taught Eli how to hammer a fence post without bending the nail. Clara taught him how to knead bread with the heel of his hand. He skinned his knee chasing a chicken, and though he tried to hide his tears, Clara scooped him up and called him brave. He learned to whistle. He hummed while drying dishes. One morning, he told them he dreamed of a meadow where the snow melted into fields of blue flowers. Clara smiled and promised, "Come spring, we'll find it." And for the first time in his young life, Eli believed her, bit by bit. Eli had begun to fill the Callahan home the way sunlight slowly seeps through shutters after a long night. At first, he called Thomas sir. Later, it became Mr. Thomas. Then one evening, without meaning to, he said Pa. Clara didn't cry right then. She smiled, set a bowl of stew in front of him, and acted as though her heart wasn't breaking open like spring ground. But later that night, out in the barn with the smell of hay and horses around her, she dropped the pitchfork and wept so hard she could barely stand. Peace, she knew, never lingered forever. One crisp morning, Thomas rode into Ironwood to fetch feed. Clara stayed behind with Eli. The boy was patching an old shirt, his stitches uneven and crooked by the third patch, which sent him into giggles. Clara laughed with him, correcting his hand but secretly cherishing the crookedness. It was a proof he was learning, proof he belonged. Then the knock came. It wasn't soft or hesitant. It pounded against the door like a gavel striking wood. Eli stiffened, his needle slipping from his fingers. Clara wiped her hands on her apron, straightened, and walked to the door. When she pulled it open, her breath caught. A tall man stood there in a heavy military-style coat, a sheriff's badge half hidden beneath the lapel. His eyes were cool, calculating, the kind that measured before they spoke. He tipped his hat. "Ma'am, Clara Callahan, yeah." Her voice was steady, though her chest tightened. "I'm Sheriff Dunn, Ironwood County." He paused just long enough for the words to land. "I've come for the boy." Her mouth went dry. "You're late. That decision's already been made." He nodded once. "So I've heard. That's why I'm not here on behalf of the placement board." Her eyes narrowed. "Then what are you here for?" From his coat, he pulled a folded document and held it up. "Warrant for inquiry. There are questions about the child's background. We need to trace where he came from, his true origin, his name, any next of kin. He may not be who he says." Clara's voice sharpened. "He's never claimed to be anything. He doesn't even remember his past. All the more reason for us to investigate." The sheriff took a step forward. "May I come in?" Clara moved into the doorway, blocking his path. "No." His smile was thin, polite, but his eyes never softened. "I suggest you reconsider. I suggest you leave." The two stared at each other, the silence stretching until Clara could hear Eli's quickened breathing behind her. Finally, Sheriff Dunn's smile faded. "I'll be back. You're not hard to find." He tipped his hat again and strode off into the wind. When Clara closed the door, Eli emerged from the side room, his face pale. "Are they going to take me?" "Not if I have breath in my body," Clara answered firmly. His hands shook. "What if they find something bad?" She dropped to her knees and cupped his face. "Then we'll face it together." His eyes welled. "Even if I'm not who you think I am, you are exactly who God sent to us. That's all I need to know." Eli buried his face in her shoulder, and she held him as tightly as if she could shield him from the law itself. When Thomas returned at dusk, Clara told him everything. He didn't speak at first, just stared out toward the ridge as though waiting for thunder to roll in. Finally, he said, "We need to be ready for what she asked, for a fight." The storm didn't come with thunder. It arrived in pieces. First came the letter. It wasn't handwritten or kind. It was stamped in red, folded tight, and delivered by a rider who didn't even dismount. He handed it over as if the paper were poisoned and rode away without a word. The seal read, "Ironwood Regional Inquiry, Office of Records and Guardianship." Clara's hands trembled as she opened it, Eli hovering in the doorway, silent but alert, as though he already knew. The letter was brief, brutal, and cold, effective immediately. A formal investigation is to be launched into the guardianship of the minor known as Eli. Surname unknown. During this time, all adoption or placement decisions are suspended. The child is to remain in Ironwood custody until inquiries are resolved. Non-compliance will be treated as obstruction and may result in legal penalties. Clara read it once, twice. The third time, her hand grew too heavy to hold the page. She let it fall to the table like a stone. Eli's voice came thin as a thread. "What does it mean?" Thomas didn't answer at first. He paced, jaw set, fists clenched, like a man bracing himself for a blow. Clara crouched in front of the boy and took his hands. "It means they want to take you again. But we're not letting that happen. Not without a fight, not ever again. Eli didn't cry. He didn't even nod. His wide eyes shuddered, closing in on themselves like storm blinds. "I knew it," he whispered. "I knew it was pretend." "Don't say that," Thomas snapped, wheeling around. "It was nice pretend," Eli murmured, "but it's never real. They always take me." Clara reached for him, but he stepped back, her hand falling through air. "Just let them come," he muttered, his voice hollow. "It's easier that way." "No, it isn't," Clara said fiercely. She stood tall now, not touching him, but letting her words hold him up. "It's never easier to give up on someone. That's just what people who don't love you tell themselves so they can sleep at night." For the first time. Eli's face twisted with anger. Not the kind of childish tantrums, but an older fury, born from too many doors slammed in his face, too many mornings waking on floors instead of beds. They said I was trouble. He choked. That I lied. That I stole. That I was no good. Thomas stepped closer, his voice steady. "Did you?" Eli shrugged, but it wasn't careless. It was shame moving through his small shoulders. "Sometimes, when I was hungry, when I was scared, or when I thought if I messed up enough, they wouldn't try to make me call them Ma or Pa." Clara's voice cracked. "Oh, baby." Eli looked up at her, his eyes burning. "You want to know who I am? They were right. I'm not who you think. I don't even remember my real name. Just Eli. Just what the preacher called me." "That's enough," Thomas said firmly. "You don't need to prove anything to us, and you're not going anywhere." Eli's lip trembled. "But the letter can go straight to the fire." Thomas interrupted, "But they didn't burn it. Not yet. They knew better than to think fire could erase what paper carried. Letters had legs. They walked into courtrooms and sat in the hands of strangers who'd never once cradled a fevered child through the night." So Thomas did something else. That night, long after Clara had fallen into uneasy sleep and Eli had curled up on his cot, Thomas sat at the table by lamplight. His hand shook only once when he wrote the line, "We are not asking permission. We are declaring our intent. This boy is our son." He sealed it with wax and delivered it himself at first light. The only man he trusted in town was Reverend Gray, the old pastor who had buried half the valley and baptized the other half. Gray listened quietly as Thomas laid it all out, every letter, every page, every wrong turn that had led Eli to their cabin door. When Thomas finished, the Reverend leaned back and nodded slowly. "I'll send this to the circuit judge," Gray said simply, "and I'll add my own testimony. You're not the first family to get caught in the snare of government papers, but if God sent that boy to you, then we'll fight to keep him with you." Thomas's throat tightened. "Thank you." Gray narrowed his eyes. "You ever think maybe the boy's past is what they're really after?" Thomas frowned, his jaw setting again. "What do you mean?" "What do you mean?" Thomas asked, his brow creasing. Reverend Gray leaned back in his chair, hands folded across his middle. "That boy's a mystery. No family name, no memory beyond a certain age. It wouldn't surprise me if there's someone out there looking for him, maybe someone important." Thomas's fists curled slowly. "If they cared, they'd have found him long before now. Or maybe they never knew where he ended up." The Reverend said quietly. Meanwhile, back at the Callahan cabin, Clara was showing Eli how to knead dough. The boy had flour streaked across his cheek, dough clinging to his elbows, and a doubtful look as she shaped a round loaf. "What if it burns?" he asked. "Then we try again," she answered. What if it's hard inside? Then we'll need better next time. He squinted at the lump of dough. What if it turns out perfect, and somebody takes it away? Clara's hand stilled in the mixing bowl. She set the spoon aside and crouched so she could see him square in the eyes. Eli, no one's taken this bread, and no one's taken you. He stared at her for a long moment. But if they do, she went on, her voice steady, then I'll follow them to the ends of the earth and bring you home. Something shifted in his face, a tiny break in the wall he'd built around himself. He gave a small nod. When the bread went into the oven, the smell that filled the cabin wasn't just warm and yeasty, it was hope itself. 3 days later, the sheriff returned. This time, he wasn't alone. Beside him rode a man in a black coat with wire-rimmed spectacles, his lips pinched like he was forever tasting something sour. Behind them rattled a small cart, a single empty seat inside. Clara opened the door. Thomas stood behind her, broad and immovable. Eli hovered just out of sight, eyes wide. "We have orders," the man in black announced. "The child is to be placed in Ironwood custody until his identity is verified and placement reassessed. This is not open for debate." Thomas didn't flinch. "Did you receive my letter?" "I did." "Then you know our position." The man's expression didn't change. "And I know the law. I have full authority here." He lifted a document for them to see. "Sheriff Dunn will escort the boy into protective custody." "You say that like he's a criminal." Thomas shot back. "No." The man replied coolly, just an unanswered question. Clara stepped forward, fire in her eyes. "Eli is not a case file. He is not property. He is our son. That's not legally accurate." "No," she said firmly, "but it's true." Sheriff Dunn removed his hat. His face looked worn, not cruel. "I don't care for this any more than you do," he admitted. "Then don't do it." Thomas pressed. The man in black cut in, his voice sharper. "You are obstructing a lawful investigation. If you continue to resist, you will face charges." "I won't comply," Clara declared. "Then you leave me no choice." He gestured to the sheriff. Eli didn't bolt this time. He walked forward on his own until he stood between Clara and Thomas. Turning to them, he whispered, "I'm not scared. I just don't want to forget." Forget what Clara asked. Bending down, his mouth curved in the saddest smile. What it felt like to be chosen. Clara's heart tore in two. She pulled him into her arms and held him as long as she could. Thomas placed a steady hand on the boy's small shoulder. "You remember this, son," Thomas said. "You're not leaving because you did something wrong. You're leaving because the world's still trying to catch up with what we already know." The man in black cleared his throat. Sheriff Dunn stepped forward. His grip was gentle as he took Eli's hand. The boy didn't fight. He only turned once to look back, and then he was gone. The wagon rattled away, disappearing into the trees. Clara sank onto the steps, her body too heavy to stand. Thomas stood like stone beside her. What burned in them both was not only grief, but something harder resolve. She sat there as the sun slid lower, spilling fire across the fields. She didn't cry. She couldn't. The tears had dried up, leaving something denser, colder, lodged deep inside. Thomas remained silent, but the promise in his eyes needed no words. They would not stop. Not now. Not ever. Eli had walked away without screaming or begging to stay, and somehow that was worse. He hadn't run because he knew running wouldn't help. That kind of silence came only from a lifetime of being denied belonging. He had called them Ma and Pa, and still, they'd let him be taken. Clara's nails dug into her palms until they hurt. Thomas laid a hand on her shoulder. "Come inside." "I can't," she whispered. "We'll bring him home. Somehow." But even his voice faltered with doubt. The wagon was gone, and with it, the fragile life they'd built together. The scent of Eli's soap lingered on the towel by the wash basin. His cup still sat half full on the table. His cot remained warm, covers tossed back the way he always left them when he crawled into her lap in the morning. At last. Clara stood and forced herself back inside. She didn't sleep. Instead, she sat at the table with a scrap of paper and made a list. It was short, but each word cut sharp. Find where they took him. Find someone who knows the judge. Find the truth about Eli's past. Bring him home. Thomas slept fitfully in the chair by the fire. When he woke and saw the list, he didn't question. He poured her coffee, nodded once, and said, "We start today." By first light, they were on horseback. Ironwood lay 12 miles east, too far to walk, but reachable by hard riding. The road was slick from last week's storm, deep ruts slowing their progress. But they pressed on. Clara's jaw stayed tight the entire way. Thomas rode ahead, eyes scanning the tree line, not because he expected ambush, but because he needed to feel he was guarding something, anything, in this fight that felt impossible. By noon, they reached the town square. Ironwood looked unchanged, small, quiet, a place where every face was familiar and every word traveled faster than the wind. But Clara's eyes saw it differently now. Every badge looked like a thief. Every office door felt like a snare. They went first to the records office. The clerk was a balding man with spectacles too small for his face and a voice dry as sand. Name, he asked without looking up. "Eli," Thomas said. "No surname. 7 years old. Taken from us 2 days ago." The man peered over his glasses. "If he was taken, then you weren't his legal guardians. We were his family," Clara snapped. The clerk hesitated, then shuffled through papers. "Records show he's currently held at the Ironwood Children's Home until reassignment or investigation is complete." "Can we see him?" Clara pressed. "That requires written approval. From whom? The overseeing judge. And that is Judge Everett." The man sighed. "But he rarely sees anyone." "Then give us directions," Thomas said grimly. The judge's house sat on a rise at the north end of town, with iron gates and tall hedges guarding it like a fortress. Clara had always thought it ugly in its perfection. Today, she found it loathsome. They weren't even allowed past the gate. A housekeeper with a pinched face met them halfway. "Judge Everett does not see visitors without appointment." "We're not here to petition," Clara said firmly. "We just need to talk. Then schedule a meeting. When, 3 weeks from now," Clara's voice cut like a blade. "That boy doesn't have 3 weeks. I'm sorry. There's nothing more I can do." The housekeeper's voice was flat, final. Clara took a steady step closer and pressed an envelope into the woman's hand. The letter had been written that very morning. Every word shaky but true. It did not beg or bargain. It told the story straight how Eli had come to their cabin by mistake, how love had made the error into providence, how he belonged with them. The woman gave no promise to deliver it, but she didn't refuse it either. She tucked the folded paper under her arm and turned away. That was all Clara could ask for. Walking back down into the town square, Clara and Thomas said nothing. The weight between them was too heavy for words. It wasn't until they spotted Reverend Gray leaving the apothecary that Thomas lifted his hand in greeting. Any word the Reverend asked. "They've locked him in the children's home," Thomas said. "Won't let us near him." "The judge refuses to see us," Clara added, her voice tight. Gray nodded grimly. "That's his way. Judge Everett rarely listens unless someone with influence pushes him." "Then who can Thomas ask?" The old man scratched at his beard, then reached into his coat and pulled out a folded, yellowed sheet. "If it's Eli's origins they want to chase, perhaps you should start there." He handed them the paper. It was a missing child's notice, dated 5 years earlier. The drawing was rough, but it showed a woman and a small boy. The mother's name was listed as Miriam Hale. The child's name, Eli, no surname, no clear record. Clara's breath hitched. Where was this filed down south near Redfern? But the trail went cold. Folks figured the mother had died and the child vanished. Thomas stared at the page. "And you're just now showing us Gray spread his palms. It came back to me only yesterday. I was combing through old files after I received your letter. Thought it might matter now." Clara clutched the flyer, her hands trembling. "If we can prove this is him, then no one can take him." Thomas finished. Gray nodded slowly. "But a flyer won't be enough. You'll need someone who can say without a doubt that boy is who you claim." "Then we'll find them," Clara said fiercely. Their first stop was the Ironwood Children's Home. The building squatted low and gray at the edge of town, more warehouse than refuge. High windows let in little light. The front door was thick oak, scarred by years of weather. Inside, a matron greeted them at a desk, her perfume thick enough to sting. "Visitors are not permitted without written permission," she said in a clipped tone. "We're not visitors," Clara replied. "We're his family. That's not what the records say." Thomas set the missing child notice on the desk. "We believe this boy is the same. Let us speak to him, and you'll see." The woman looked at the paper with cool disinterest. "Even if it's true, that doesn't make you his guardians." "No," Clara said firmly, "but it means he doesn't belong to the state either." The matron hesitated, then finally motioned with her hand. 1 minute, through the glass. No contact. They followed her down a dim hallway that smelled of dust and damp wool. At the end was a small visiting room divided by a pane of glass. On the other side, Eli sat alone on a bench. He looked smaller than Clara remembered, paler too. When his eyes met hers, they lit up, though he didn't move like he wasn't sure if this was real. Clara pressed her palm to the glass. "Sweetheart." Eli lifted his hand and placed it against hers on the other side. "We think we've found your mother's name," Clara whispered. "Eli," Thomas said carefully, "does the name Miriam Hale mean anything to you?" The boy frowned, searching. His lips moved slowly. She sang. Clara leaned forward, heart pounding. What did she sing? An old hymn about wings and rivers. Her throat closed. "I'll fly away. Oh, glory." Eli whispered the words with her, their voices overlapping faintly through the barrier. The sound of that shared hymn, fragile and trembling, was enough to silence even the matron. She froze in the corner, arms crossed, lips pursed, but she didn't interrupt. She couldn't, not after hearing that. Eli's small hand stayed pressed to the glass. Clara's matched it. It wasn't enough, but it was all they had. "I remember her hair," Eli murmured. his eyes unfocused, far away, brown like mine, and she smelled like oranges. Clara's voice cracked. What happened to her? There was a fire, I think. He swallowed. She wrapped me in a blanket. I woke up somewhere else. Thomas's shoulders stiffened. Do you remember who found you a man in a big coat? He gave me water, called me boy, then he gave me to someone else. That's all. The matron finally spoke. Time's up. Thomas straightened. We need more. Rules, she said coldly. Clara turned, her voice low and urgent. He just remembered his mother's name. That is no small thing. Please. The matron looked from Eli to Clara. Something flickered in her eyes, though her face stayed hard. At last she said, 5 more minutes. Eli leaned forward, panic in his eyes. They said they're sending me away. Clara's blood chilled. Who the man in the black coat? He said if nothing's decided soon, they'll move me to a long-term home. When Clara asked sharply, he didn't say. Clara turned to the matron. Let us speak to whoever is in charge. You already have, the woman said. He isn't here today. Thomas placed a hand on Clara's arm. Not here. Not now. Clara swallowed hard, then pressed her palm to the glass again. Eli, listen to me. You stay strong. We're not done. I don't want to go, he whispered. You're not going anywhere. Hold on just a little longer. We're fighting for you. His eyes shone. He didn't cry, he never did, but he looked as though he might. The matron escorted them back, but before they left, she muttered almost to herself. He sings that hymn often. Clara stopped. Did you ever ask him about it, Children Ramble? The woman replied. Most of it's nonsense. You learn not to listen. Maybe you should have, Clara said softly. They rode back into town without speaking. The streets felt narrower, noisier, every face watching. Thomas's hands were white-knuckled on the reins. Clara felt emptied by the visit, yet at the same time something inside her burned brighter. Eli remembered. That meant someone else might remember him too. She pulled the old flyer from her coat again, staring at the faint lines of the drawing. Reverend Gray had given them a trail. It was time to follow it. They turned their horses south, toward Red Fern. The road wound through hills where rivers braided silver in the fading light. Clara packed bread and apples in her saddlebag. Thomas carried his sidearm, though neither spoke of why. By the time they reached the Red Fern post office, the sun was already sliding toward the horizon. The sky bled orange, the day running out, but their search had only just begun. I'm sorry. There isn't anything else I can do, the housekeeper said stiffly, her hand still clutching the iron gate. Clara didn't argue. She simply pressed an envelope into the woman's palm. The letter inside was one she had written at dawn, her hand trembling as she folded it. It wasn't a plea or a desperate bargain. It was the truth about Eli, about the mistake that brought him to their cabin, about the love that made him theirs. The woman didn't promise to pass it along, but she didn't throw it back either. That was enough. Clara and Thomas walked back to the square in silence. For a long while, neither spoke, not until Thomas spotted Reverend Cole leaving the apothecary with a satchel under his arm. Any news, the Reverend asked when he saw their faces. They've locked him in the children's home, Thomas said, voice hard. Won't even let us look him in the eye. And Judge Ashford won't grant us an audience, Clara added, the words sharp in her throat. Cole shook his head slowly. That doesn't surprise me. Ashford rarely bends an ear unless someone with power gives it a tug. Then who can help us? Thomas demanded. The old preacher scratched his chin, then pulled a yellowed sheet of paper from his coat. If it's his origin they're chasing, maybe this matters. It was a missing child notice, 5 years old. The drawing was rough, but showed a young woman with a boy at her side. Miriam Hale, Clara whispered, tracing the faded name. And her son. Reverend Cole said. Eli. No surname. The timeline, the hair, the eyes, it all matches. Thomas's jaw tightened. Why show us this now? Because I only remembered it yesterday, Cole admitted. I dug through my files after reading your letter. The case went cold years back. They said she'd likely perished, and the boy vanished. Clara's hands shook as she held the page. If we can prove this, no one can take him. Thomas finished. You'll need more than paper, the Reverend warned. You'll need someone who remembers him. Then we'll find them, Clara said, determination sharpening her words. That resolve carried them to the Ironwood Children's Home, a squat, gray building on the edge of town that looked more like a storehouse than a refuge. The matron who met them smelled of too much perfume and not nearly enough kindness. Visitors aren't permitted without authorization, she said crisply. We're not visitors, Clara answered. We're his family. That isn't what the records say. Thomas slid the missing child flyer across her desk. We believe he's this boy. Let us see him. The woman scanned the notice without a flicker of interest. Even if you're right, that doesn't make you guardians. It makes him something more than state property, Clara snapped. The matron hesitated, then motioned toward a side hall. 1 minute, through the glass only. The hallway smelled of mildew and dust. At the end was a narrow room divided by a thick pane. Eli sat on the far side. He looked smaller, paler, but when he spotted them, his eyes lit with a flicker of recognition. Still, he didn't move. Clara pressed her hand to the glass. Sweetheart. Eli lifted his own small hand, mirroring hers. We found her name, Clara whispered. Miriam Hale, Thomas said carefully. Does that sound familiar? The boy furrowed his brow. His lips moved slowly. She sang. Clara's heart hammered. What did she sing a hymn? About wings, about rivers? Tears blurred Clara's eyes. I'll fly away. Oh, glory. Eli's lips moved with hers, their voices nearly overlapping. The sound of it fragile, half-remembered, yet certain made the matron stiffen where she stood. She didn't interrupt. Couldn't. I remember her hair, Eli murmured. Brown, like mine, and she smelled like oranges. Clara's voice broke. What happened to her? There was a fire, I think. She put me under a blanket. I woke up somewhere else. Thomas's shoulders tightened. Do you know who found you? A man in a coat? Gave me water, called me boy, then handed me off to someone else. Time's up, the matron said. Please, more. Clara begged. The woman hesitated, then sighed. 5 more minutes. Eli leaned closer, panic flickering in his eyes. They said they'll send me away. Clara froze. Who said that the man in black? Said, if nothing's decided, they'll move me to a long-term place. When he didn't say, Clara turned sharply. Let us speak to whoever makes that call. You already have, the matron replied flatly. He isn't here today. Thomas placed a hand on Clara's arm. Not here, he murmured. Not now. Clara pressed her hand harder against the glass. Eli, you hold on. You hear me. We are not finished. I don't want to go, he whispered. You're not going anywhere. Just hold on. We're fighting for you. He nodded, his eyes shining. He never cried, not outright, but his face trembled close to it. The matron escorted them back, but as they left, she muttered, almost to herself, "He sings that hymn often." Clara stopped. "And you never asked him why children ramble," the woman said. "You learn not to listen. Maybe you should have," Clara said softly. They rode back into town, the streets suddenly too narrow, too loud. Thomas's knuckles whitened on the reins. Clara clutched the flyer as though it were a lifeline. Eli remembered his mother, her song, her scent. That meant someone else might remember too. By dawn the next day, they were heading south toward Redfern. The trail was faint, but it was all they had. The post office clerk there was a wiry woman with sharp eyes that missed nothing. She barely glanced up when they entered. "Help you?" Clara stepped forward. "We're looking for a woman named Miriam Hale. She and her boy vanished 5 years ago." The clerk raised a brow. "That was a long time back. We believe her son survived," Thomas said. The clerk scratched her chin. "You're the third folks this year to ask after her." Clara froze. "Who else, tall fellow, southern drawl, came last spring, wanted copies of that same flyer, paid cash, never left a name, never came back." Clara's pulse quickened. "What about Miriam herself?" she pressed. The clerk nodded slowly. "She lived with her brother, out in a cabin past the ridge. Folks said he wasn't right after the war, kept to himself. The boy, cute little thing, always singing, barefoot even in winter. Then one day, both gone. No fire. Thomas asked. There was one, but not at their place. Barrow Farm burned that same week. Maybe that's what the boy recalls. Is the cabin still there? Doubt it, but the land's still in Hale's name. Take Ridge Road past Dry Creek. You'll see the clearing." They thanked her and left. By dusk they reached the ridge. The clearing lay quiet beneath a cold wind. Only a crumbled stone chimney and blackened beams remained, half buried in grass. Clara knelt near the chimney, brushing soot from a charred board. "This was real," she whispered. Thomas searched a smaller foundation nearby and found a rusted cot frame, a tiny boot. He held it in his hand, the size enough to make his throat close. Clara stepped beside him, eyes wide. "Do you think she died here? Maybe, maybe not." But they left in a hurry. A gust scattered ashes, revealing something pale caught between stones. Clara bent and drew it free, a scrap of cloth stitched with faded blue letters. Eli. Her breath caught. His blanket. Thomas took it gently. The fabric was worn thin, but the stitching was clear. He folded it carefully and slipped it inside his coat. "This is where it began," he said softly. "Where Eli's life split apart. Where his story vanished into smoke. But now, at last, they had proof." The next morning they returned to Ironwood. Judge Ashford's door was shut to the public, but Clara didn't waste time knocking. She walked straight to Reverend Cole. "We found his home," she said, holding out the scrap of cloth. The Reverend examined the stitching, then nodded once. "I'll get you inside." That afternoon, they stood in a silent courtroom, empty benches, only Judge Ashford and his clerk present. Mr. Halloway, the man in black, waited with 2 folders under his arm. Ashford read their letters, studied the cloth. For a long time, he said nothing. "This proves origin, not placement," the judge finally said. Clara stepped forward. He remembered the hymn. He described the cabin. "We found the blanket. What else do you need?" The judge looked to Thomas. And you still want him. Thomas didn't blink. We want our son back. Ashford tapped a finger on his desk. There are procedures. I cannot erase them, but I can move them forward. Clara's breath caught. How long? If all goes well, a week? Thomas's jaw tightened. He can't last a week in that place. Ashford studied them. Then tell me what else you have, because this is enough for a hearing, not a promise. Clara reached into her apron and drew out a folded slip of paper. Her list. She placed it on the judge's desk. He read it slowly, then lifted his gaze. You made a list. I didn't know what else to do. Clara admitted. It was either that or break. The judge held her eyes for a moment. Then he rose. Bring the boy tomorrow at noon. We'll have the hearing. Clara didn't cry until they stepped back into the cold air. When she did, it felt like the sky itself cracked open. That night, they cleaned Eli's small room, not because it needed it, but because it was their way of saying, this time, you come home and stay. The morning of the hearing dawned golden, sunlight spilling across the frost. Clara lay awake, listening to the boards creak, remembering every loss, every empty crib. But this time the ache was fire, not hollow. Thomas shaved, pressed his shirt, tightened his boots like a man preparing for war. His jaw was iron, his eyes darker than the dawn. Ironwood hadn't changed, but the town felt different, tight, braced, holding its breath. They tethered the horse near the church. Reverend Cole joined them at the side door, hat in hand. You ready? He asked. No, Clara admitted, but I'll do it anyway. That's all God ever asks, the Reverend said. The courthouse was a plain box of stone. Inside, Judge Ashford sat stiff behind his desk, his clerk scribbling notes beside him. Across the aisle stood Mr. Holloway, the man in black, folders tucked tight under his arm, eyes cold as iron. Eli wasn't there yet, and that almost made Clara collapse. Clara had fastened the old brooch her mother left her, pinned tight against her collar. She didn't believe it carried magic, but she needed something solid to grip when the world tilted. Thomas found her hand as they stepped into the courthouse. He squeezed once, then again, the strength of his palm steadying her. Judge Ashford sat high behind the desk, his face carved from stone. Let the record show the petitioners have arrived. We were told the boy would be present, Thomas said, his voice firm. He is en route. The judge answered, escorted. Clara's stomach churned, but Ashford continued briskly. Then let us begin. Mr. Holloway, the man in the black coat, rose first. Your Honor, while it is true that the petitioners have developed an emotional attachment to the minor known as Eli, the legal process of custody was never completed. Furthermore, the child's origin remains uncertain. He has no surname, no documented relatives. For all we know, there may be other claims outside of Ironwood jurisdiction. Clara's chest constricted. Holloway turned a page in his file. Additionally, the boy was never formally placed with the Callahans. His arrival at their home was by mistake. That mistake saved his life. Clara snapped before she could stop herself. Ashford raised a hand. Mrs. Callahan, you will have your turn. Holloway's lips tightened, but he pressed on. The Whitmore family, the intended recipients, chose not to contest custody once they learned of the error. Their forbearance does not make the Callahans' custody lawful, nor does it strip it of meaning. Reverend Cole called from the gallery. Ashford frowned. You are not a representative of the placement board. Reverend. No, Cole said evenly, "but I was there. I witnessed the change in that boy under their roof. I also provided the missing child's notice that pointed us to Miriam Hale's son. That matters." Holloway faltered, just for a beat. Ashford gestured, "Proceed." Thomas stepped forward, laying the scrap of cloth on the bench. "Your Honor, this came from the ruins of Hale's cabin, Eli's name stitched in thread. The boy remembered his mother's hymn, described the homestead, matched the timeline. His memories may be scattered, but they're real." Holloway sniffed. "A singed scrap of cloth does not decide legal parentage." "No," Thomas said, jaw clenched, "but a child's voice ought to count for something." The room went still. Clara stepped next, pulling a folded sheet from her coat. It wasn't a contract or certificate, but a drawing Eli had made in charcoal, 3 figures outside their cabin, hands joined, smiling. He drew this 2 days before they took him. She whispered, "He called us Ma and Pa, and we called him son. That should matter. It has to." Judge Ashford stared at the crude sketch longer than anyone expected. Then, behind him, a door creaked open. Eli entered, walking between 2 escorts from the home. They didn't touch him, didn't guide him. He moved like a soldier headed to a fight he already expected to lose. When his eyes landed on Clara and Thomas, his body jolted, but he didn't cry or run. He simply blinked and lowered himself onto the bench. "Eli," Judge Ashford said gently, "do you know why you're here?" The boy nodded once. "Do you want to be here?" "No." "Why not?" Eli's voice was steady. "Because I want to go home. And where is home, son?" He pointed without hesitation. "With them." His finger trembled toward Clara and Thomas. The judge leaned forward. "Can you tell me why? Because they saw me?" Eli said. His eyes did not waver. "Not a case, not a burden. Me." Holloway shifted in irritation. "Your Honor." Ashford silenced him with a glance. Eli kept going. "I've been in a lot of places, some with beds, some with floors. Some folks gave me food, some yelled, some just waited for me to leave. But no one ever stayed. They stayed when I got sick, when I dropped the bucket, when I asked dumb questions. They stayed. They never asked me to earn it. I just was." Clara's throat burned, but she didn't interrupt. "Do you remember your mother?" Eli Ashford asked softly. "Little things," Eli whispered. "Her hair, her song, her hands. I think she died. I waited a long time for someone else to come." The judge leaned back, tapping his chin thoughtfully. Then his gaze shifted to Clara and Thomas. "If granted, will you adopt this boy formally?" "Yes," they said together, voices firm. "Will you provide for his education, health, and spiritual care?" "Yes." "Will you treat him as your own, with every right and responsibility therein?" Thomas stepped forward, his voice iron. "He is our own." Judge Ashford did not smile, but his voice warmed as he struck the gavel. "Then I grant permanent guardianship with intent to finalize adoption within 60 days. The sound of wood meeting wood echoed like thunder. Clara gasped. Eli didn't move until she ran to him. Then he leapt from the bench into her arms, clinging so tightly she nearly lost her balance. Thomas reached them next, and for the first time in that cold courthouse, 3 voices broke together, not with grief, but with victory. They left Ironwood by midday. Eli rode in Clara's lap, his small hands gripping her shawl as though it might vanish. Thomas didn't speak much on the journey, but every so often he turned in the wagon seat to make sure the boy was still there. He was. By twilight, they reached the cabin. The air smelled of pine smoke and damp earth. Eli hopped down and sprinted for the front steps. He stopped suddenly, looked back. "Can I open it?" Thomas's throat thickened. "It's your home. You open it." Eli swung the door wide. Inside, the fire crackled, the cot waited, and the loaf Clara had baked that morning still rested warm beneath a cloth. He stepped inside first. They followed. The door shut behind them, and this time it stayed shut. That night, Clara tucked him under the quilt he had once carried, convinced he'd be sent away again. "Are you staying forever now?" he asked softly. She kissed his forehead. "We're not going anywhere. Not ever. Do you feel safe, sweetheart?" He nodded. "I just didn't think I'd ever have a place where I could keep things." Clara didn't cry. Her tears were long spent. Instead, she wrapped her arms around him and whispered, "This place will always hold you." The first time Eli called her Mama, he didn't mean to. It slipped out one evening when he asked her to mend a seam on his shirt. He froze, as did she. He opened his mouth to take it back, but Clara was already across the room, cupping his face in her hands. "Say it again." He did, and this time both of them wept. Thomas stood in the doorway, silent, his head bowed like a man receiving grace. Months passed. Winter melted into spring. Eli grew bolder. He wandered deeper into the woods, brought back kindling, whistled on the path home. He began reading more. Clara gave him lessons each night, and one evening he asked if he could write a letter, to whom she asked. He shrugged. "The Whitmores, to thank them for letting me stay." At the bottom of the page he signed it Eli Callahan. His heart thudded so loudly he thought the rafters would hear it. Thomas clapped a hand on his shoulder. "That's the last one, son." Eli looked up. That's it, Thomas said. Nothing else needed changing. That night, Eli slept with his door open, not from fear, but because he no longer had to be afraid. By fall, the orchard was ready. The three of them harvested side by side, Thomas high on the ladder, Clara sorting apples, Eli balancing the basket. Sunlight poured through the branches, the air rich with ripeness. "I want to plant something next spring," Eli announced suddenly. Thomas raised a brow. "What kind? Something that grows slow. Something that stays." Thomas nodded. "We'll find the seed." They would. And in years to come, Eli would grow taller, his shoulders broad like Thomas's. His laugh would ring across the fields. He would remember not just the fire and the waiting, but the night he knocked on the wrong cabin door, and the words that saved him, "Please be our child." He had been, and he always would be. This story reminds us that family is not always written by blood, but by the courage to stay when others walk away. Clara and Thomas Callahan could have shut the door on Eli, telling themselves the boy was never meant for them. Instead, they opened their hearts, choosing love over rules, presence over convenience. For many of us who have lived long enough to know loss, the Callahan's journey whispers a simple truth. Belonging is not earned. It is given. And sometimes, the greatest gift we can offer another soul is the promise. You are safe here. You are wanted, at 60, 70, or beyond. We know life is fragile and short. What remains are not the papers signed or the rules obeyed, but the people we loved fiercely, even when it was difficult. This story is a mirror, asking each of us who have we chosen to hold close, even when it cost us something. Because in the end, it is love, quiet, stubborn, and enduring, that gives us a home that no storm can take away. Thank you, dear friends, for sharing your time and heart with us today. Stories like this remind us of the strength of love and the hope we can carry, no matter the years behind us. If this story touched you, please like this video. Share it with someone who might need a little reminder of love's power, and subscribe to our channel. Together, we'll keep these timeless tales alive